kingdom of Arendar lay wrapped in endless winter. Snow fell like powdered silver, blanketing the tall black stone walls of the Alpha King's fortress. The wind howled through the towers, carrying whispers of fear. For generations, Kalen, the Alpha King, ruled with an iron hand. People spoke his name in hushed tones, afraid that even the echo might carry their courage to him. They said his eyes were colder than ice, that his anger could freeze the heart of any warrior. To the people of Arendar, he was not a man, he was the storm itself. Kalen sat upon his throne, a massive seat carved from black stone and veined with frost. His cape of midnight blue brushed the floor, and his silver crown gleamed like moonlight on ice. Around him, courtiers bowed low, their faces pale and anxious. None dared speak unless spoken to, and even then, their words were carefully measured. For the Alpha King did not forgive easily. Fear was his ally. Outside the throne room, the kingdom bustled despite the cold. Snow-laden streets hid poverty and hunger, whispers of rebellion, and rumors of strange magic creeping in from the distant mountains. Kalen had ruled through fear, but a sense of unease had begun to stir in him. Something in the air told him that the winter of his rule might be ending. It was in this frozen kingdom that Leora arrived. She was an Omega, low-born and rejected by her family for reasons she rarely spoke aloud. People called her the Unwanted One, though she carried herself with a quiet dignity that none could take away. Her dark hair tumbled over her shoulders, and her green eyes were sharp and alive, even in the snow's pallor. Leora had seen suffering, abandonment, and scorn, but she had also learned strength. Her courage was not loud, but steady, the flame of a candle in the coldest night. The streets whispered of her audacity. Rumors reached Kalen that a rejected Omega had dared to speak boldly, questioning the fairness of the Alpha King. Most rulers would have dismissed such claims or sent soldiers to silence her. But Kalen, drawn by something he did not understand, wanted to see her for himself. The day she was brought before the court, the air was sharper than usual. Courtiers shuffled nervously, sensing the tension. Leora's feet crunched on the snow-dusted marble floor as she stepped into the throne room. The room was vast, its ceilings carved with intricate frost patterns that glimmered faintly in the cold light. Kellen's throne towered above her, and for a moment, the Omega felt the weight of 1,000 frozen years pressing down on her. But she did not falter. Kellen's eyes were piercing, silver-gray, and unyielding. He regarded her silently, and in that silence, the hall seemed to shrink. The courtiers were invisible to him. Their fear was only background noise. His focus was on her, the audacious Omega, who dared stand where no one else would. "Speak," Kalen said, his voice low, like ice grinding against stone. Leora straightened her back. Her voice was calm but steady. "Your judgment punishes the innocent, Alpha King. The villagers you condemned last week, those who broke no law, why do they suffer?" A ripple of shock went through the court. No one had dared to address Kalen in this way for decades. Murmurs rose and fell like wind through hollow trees. Kellen's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. He wanted to hear her fully. "Your laws favor those born to wealth and power," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "But strength is not only in birthright, nor wisdom in crowns. Your fear of rebellion blinds you. You punish loyalty as easily as defiance. You have grown distant from your people, Alpha King, and I will not bow to a rule that sees justice as punishment alone." Kellen's eyes narrowed. He had heard criticism before, but never like this. Her words were not motivated by personal gain or fear. They came from truth, unflinching and sharp. For the first time in many years, Kalen felt a crack in his control. This Omega was not afraid. She did not shrink beneath his gaze, and that both angered and intrigued him. "Do you know what it costs to speak so freely?" he asked, his tone sharp now, like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Do you know the danger that comes with defying an Alpha King?" Leora met his gaze without hesitation. "I know that silence has cost more lives than courage ever will," she said. Her words were simple, yet they carried weight beyond her years. The court held its breath. A single snowflake drifted through the open balcony, landing on Kellen's crown. The sound of its light touch seemed louder than the whispers of the courtiers. Kellen studied her face, searching for deceit, for fear, for weakness. But all he found was defiance and honesty and something else. A strange spark that reminded him of a time long ago, when he had not yet become the storm of Arendar. "Very well," he said finally, his voice quieter, almost thoughtful. "You will come to the palace tomorrow, alone." The Omega's heart quickened. She did not know if the summons meant death, or audience, punishment, or test. Yet she bowed, a gesture of respect, not submission, and turned to leave. The courtiers whispered louder now, unsure whether to be horrified or amazed. That night, the snow fell heavier than usual. Leora walked through the streets to her modest lodging. She could feel the weight of eyes upon her, though none dared follow. The city was full of shadows, and the winds whispered secrets of the Alpha King's power. And yet, despite the fear, she felt a strange thrill. She had spoken truth to a ruler who feared nothing, and in doing so, had awakened something dangerous and beautiful. Kellen, meanwhile, stood on the highest tower of the palace, looking over the kingdom. His eyes were distant, lost in thoughts he had long ignored. The image of the Omega's fearless gaze haunted him. He had lived decades in isolation, letting fear and control rule his heart. And now, for the first time, he felt a stir of something he had long forgotten: curiosity, and perhaps a spark of longing. The winter storm that night seemed to echo his inner turbulence. Snow whipped around the towers, clashing against the stone like the anger and uncertainty within him. Somewhere deep in his heart, Kellen wondered if the Omega would survive the palace's halls. If she would truly stand against him, or if she would bend like all others had. But he did not look away from her image in his mind, and that small, unexplainable fascination was dangerous, both for the Alpha King and for the Omega he had summoned. Outside, the city slept uneasily. The people of Arendar did not know that a single defiant voice had already begun to change the fate of their kingdom, a voice that dared to speak truth to a king who knew only fear. And as the storm roared louder, it carried a whisper on its wind, a promise or a threat, that nothing in Arendar would ever be the same again. In the coldest hour of the night, Leora's breath rose in small clouds as she thought of the summons. Alone with the Alpha King, alone in the palace that had crushed so many, she felt fear, yes, but also an unshakable determination. If she was to survive, she would need her wits, her courage, and her unbending spirit. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would awaken something in the king that no one else had dared to touch. The night stretched long. Snow piled on rooftops, covering the city in a quiet, deceptive calm. And in the heart of the fortress, Kellen stared into the dark, wondering if the storm he ruled outside was nothing compared to the storm that had just entered his life. Dawn broke over the frostbitten towers of Arendar, casting pale gold light across the black stone of the palace. Snow sparkled like scattered diamonds, untouched and pure. Leora stood at the entrance, her breath rising in small clouds, her heart steady despite the chill in her bones. Today, she would face the Alpha King alone. Today, she would stand in the palace that had broken the strongest of souls. The corridors of the fortress were silent, except for the faint echo of her footsteps. Enormous tapestries hung on the walls, depicting long-forgotten battles and rulers long dead. The cold seemed heavier here, as if the stones themselves remembered the fear that had once filled these halls. Leora's green eyes scanned every shadow, every corner. She did not flinch, but she did not pretend ignorance of the danger she walked into. At the throne room, Kellen waited. He did not rise or bow. He remained seated like a statue of night and frost. The torchlight flickered across his crown and the sharp angles of his face. His gaze, cold and calculating, met hers. For a moment, silence fell like a thick blanket over them both. Neither spoke. The courtiers had vanished, leaving the room empty of witnesses. "Sit," Kellen finally said, gesturing to a chair before him. His voice was firm, but there was a trace of something unspoken, a question, test. Leora did not sit immediately. She studied him instead. "I have no reason to bow," she said softly. but I have reasons to speak truth. Kellen's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. Bold, he muttered. Few survive boldness in my halls. Fewer still, without fear in their eyes. Flunia met his gaze without flinching. Fear is easy. Courage is harder, she said. Her words hung in the cold air, echoing faintly. Kellen's eyes, silver gray and sharp, narrowed. Intrigued, despite himself, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the carved arms of the throne. Why do you question me, Omega? He asked. Is it defiance? Arrogance? Or is it truth that you seek? Truth, Leora replied without hesitation. Your people suffer while you sit in this throne. They fear you, yes, but they do not respect you. Respect comes from understanding, not fear. I want to know why a king who commands so much chooses to punish instead of guide. Kalen studied her, as if seeing her for the first time. No one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had dared to speak openly about his rule or his decisions. He expected lies, flattery, excuses, but not honesty. And certainly not courage. You speak of understanding, he said slowly, yet you know nothing of the burdens I carry. You see only the results of my choices, not the reasons. You call me cruel, but perhaps cruelty is the only way I have known to protect this kingdom. Leora took a careful step closer. Then let me help you understand. Let me help you see what your people truly need. I am not here to attack you, Alpha King. I am here to speak truth. Kellen's eyes flickered, a movement so subtle it could have been mistaken for reflection in the torchlight. He felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him, curiosity. Something he had long buried under years of fear and control. Very well, he said, rising from his throne. The sound of his movement echoed like distant thunder. Walk with me. Leora followed him into the palace gardens, a place most feared to tread. The frost on the hedges sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars, and the snow crunched under their feet. Kalen walked silently at first, his presence commanding, yet strange in its restraint. It was as if he were testing her, not with words, but with the unspoken challenge of simply allowing her to walk beside him. You are brave, Kalan said finally, breaking the silence. Few would follow me willingly into the open air, into the cold, without a weapon or shield. Yet you walk with only your words. I have my courage, Leora replied simply, and I have my honesty. That is all I need to face you. They walked for what felt like hours, though the sky was only pale morning. Their conversation moved from politics to the hardships of the people, from winter crops to the suffering of villagers whose voices were rarely heard. Leora spoke openly, and Kalen listened not as a ruler listening to a subject, but as a man who was hearing truth for the first time in decades. A subtle bond began to form between them. Not yet trust, but recognition. Kalen began to see her not as a defiant Omega, but as someone who reflected the parts of himself he had long ignored, the lonely, human parts that had been buried beneath fear and power. Leora began to see him not as a cruel king, but as a man weighed down by duty, isolation, and choices that no one could fully understand. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the stone walls of the palace. Snow swirled around them, and shadows stretched long across the frozen garden. Leora shivered, but Kellen's gaze remained steady, assessing, protective even. Though he did not touch her. You are not afraid, Kalen said quietly. Why? Because fear does not help anyone, Leora replied. And because some things are worth facing, even if they terrify us. You cannot protect this kingdom by yourself, Alpha King. You need others, whether you admit it or not. Kellen's jaw tightened. Her words were not flattery nor rebellion. They were simple, undeniable truths, and the truth was uncomfortable. It demanded attention. It demanded change. Suddenly the wind shifted again, and Kalen froze. A dark shape moved through the palace gates, a figure cloaked in shadow, silent and deliberate. The courtiers had long whispered of rebels and assassins, but Kalen had not expected anyone to enter the palace so boldly. Stay close, Kalen said, his voice low. Without looking back, he led Leora toward a side path, keeping his eyes on the approaching shadow. Leora followed without question, her heart steady but alert, The figure stepped into the moonlight and revealed a weapon glinting in the frost. But before the shadow could move, Kalen acted with precision. Stepping between the threat and Leora, the Alpha King's speed and strength were unmatched. And in a matter of moments, the figure was disarmed and fleeing into the storm. Leora's pulse raced, but she did not step back. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice calm despite the danger. Kellen's expression darkened. "Enemies," he said simply. "Those who fear change, those who believe courage is weakness. You have made yourself known to them now, Omega. They will come again." Despite the danger, Leora did not feel fear not in the same way. Instead, a fierce determination rose within her. She had seen the Alpha King act not as a ruler, but as a protector. She had witnessed his strength, and she had walked beside him without flinching. And something deeper began to stir, a trust that was fragile but growing. A connection neither of them could yet name. They returned to the palace, the snow crunching beneath their feet. Inside, Kalen remained silent, but the tension in his body softened. For the first time in many years, he allowed someone into his world without suspicion, without immediate judgment. Leora, for her part, felt a strange warmth in his presence, a human warmth beneath the ice of his reputation. Night fell, and the palace became quiet once more. Leora sat in a small chamber provided for her, reflecting on the day. She had faced the Alpha King, spoken truth, and survived. She had seen a side of him that few had ever glimpsed, a man capable of thought, reflection, and perhaps even change. Kalen, alone in his throne room, looked out over the kingdom once more. The storm had not passed. Snow still fell in thick layers, covering the land in white silence. Yet he felt something different. The fire of curiosity, of challenge, of connection, had begun to thaw a part of him, he thought, forever frozen. And he knew that the Omega, who dared to speak against him, would return tomorrow. For Kalen, the question was no longer whether she would survive his scrutiny. It was whether he could survive hers. And for Leora, the question was whether she could trust the man who had so long inspired fear in all, who lived under his rule. The wind whispered outside the palace windows, carrying with it the scent of snow and the hint of danger still lingering beyond the walls. The storm was not over, and the kingdom of Arendar was not yet safe. But one thing was certain. A single voice, brave and unbroken, had begun to stir the heart of the Alpha King, and the first seed of change had been planted. The wind howled across the frozen towers of Arendar, rattling the black stone walls like an angry beast. Kalen, the Alpha King, stood atop the highest balcony, eyes scanning the horizon. The winter storm had grown fiercer, almost unnatural in its intensity, as if the land itself had taken notice of the Omega who had dared to speak against him. Leora's words, her defiance, still echoed in his mind. Her courage had not faded, even after the dangers she had faced in his court. Kellen's instincts, honed by decades of ruling through fear, told him that danger approached. His kingdom's enemies were bold, but this felt different. There was magic in the wind, an unnatural chill that went beyond the snowstorm. He knew, with a weight in his chest, that this was not ordinary rebellion. Inside the palace, Leora prepared herself for the day ahead. She had learned much in the brief hours she had spent beside Kalen, his rules, his habits, his strengths, and the subtle cracks in his armor, both physical and emotional. Yet she also knew that her place in this world was dangerous. She was a rejected Omega, unprotected by birth or status. Yet she had a courage that few could claim, and a determination that refused to bow to fear. Kalen found her in the gardens, walking silently among frost-covered hedges. He did not speak at first, only observing her. The way she moved, deliberate yet unafraid, made him wonder how someone so small, so underestimated, could hold such power in her presence. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. "The storm. It is unnatural. Not from the weather, but from the land itself." Leora nodded, her eyes narrowing as she studied the sky. "I can sense it," she said. "There is magic here, ancient and bitter. It has been waiting, perhaps, for someone like me or someone like you." Kalen frowned. Do you think it is dangerous? It is, she replied without hesitation, and it will not be satisfied with words alone. We will need courage and trust if we are to face it. He studied her for a long moment, noting the fire in her eyes. Trust was not something Kalen gave lightly. Yet in this Omega, he sensed something rare: honesty, strength, and an unwavering will. He knew reluctantly that he would need her if the threat was to be overcome. No sooner had the words left her lips than the ground trembled beneath their feet. The ice on the fountains cracked, sending shards like crystal raining down. Shadows moved unnaturally along the edges of the garden, dark forms that twisted and flickered. Kellen's hand went instinctively to his sword, and Leora stood beside him, her own body tensing in readiness. From the shadows emerged a figure, cloaked and silent, their presence radiating a cold that rivaled the storm itself. The figure moved with unnatural speed, striking at Kalen before either could react fully. But Leora, anticipating the movement, stepped forward and deflected the attack with a force born of courage rather than skill. The figure recoiled, surprised by her intervention. Kellen's sword flashed, precise and deadly, forcing the shadow back. The battle was not long, but it was enough to reveal the truth. This was no ordinary enemy. These were the servants of a curse bound to the Alpha King's bloodline. For centuries, Kellen's family had carried a burden, a darkness that punished defiance, that demanded fear and submission from all who lived under the crown. And now, the curse had awakened. Drawn to the Omega who dared to speak truth, breathing heavily, Kalen sheathed his sword. "This is why I have ruled with fear," he said quietly, almost to himself. "To keep the curse at bay, to protect my people." Leora's eyes softened as she looked at him. "Then it is not weakness that defines you," she said. "It is the weight of duty you have carried alone. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Let me help you." Kellen's eyes searched hers, seeing not only courage but compassion. No one had ever offered to stand beside him, not as a weapon, but as an ally, as an equal. It unsettled him, yet also filled him with a strange relief. Perhaps the Omega was right. Perhaps he did not have to face this darkness alone. The curse, however, was not idle. Shadows moved faster, taking shapes of twisted wolves and ice spirits, creatures of nightmare and frost. They circled the garden, forcing Kalen and Leora to retreat deeper into the palace grounds. The wind carried whispers, voices of the long dead, of ancestors who had succumbed to the same darkness. Kellen's strength alone would not suffice this time in the palace's inner sanctum. Leora took a deep breath, closing her eyes. She focused on the pulse of the land, the ancient magic that lingered beneath the stone floors and frost-covered walls. She felt the sorrow, the anger, the loneliness of the Alpha King's ancestors, and the curse that had fed upon it for centuries. Reaching into her own strength, born of rejection and survival, she extended her will outward, facing the darkness without fear. Kalen watched her, astonished. The Omega's courage was tangible, almost like a shield of light against the shadows. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, not just for survival, but for redemption. Her strength was not like his. On it was quieter, steadier, born of life and pain, not power and fear. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing, as Leora's resolve grew. Kalen stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. Not to control, but to stand together. Their combined presence, strength and courage mingling, pushed back the darkness. The ice spirits shrieked, the twisted wolves vanished, and the oppressive chill in the air began to lift. When the storm finally subsided, silence fell over the palace grounds. Snow drifted lazily to the frozen fountains, untouched and peaceful. Kalen lowered his hand, and for a long moment neither spoke. The battle was over, but the threat had not vanished entirely. The curse had been weakened, but not destroyed. And the truth was undeniable. Leora had saved him as much as he had protected her. "Why did you help me?" Kalen asked quietly. His voice was almost foreign to him, soft and reflective. "Because no one else would," Leora said simply. "Because I believe courage deserves to be rewarded and truth deserves to be heard. And because I trust you." Kellen's eyes met hers, silver and gray, hard yet beginning to soften. Trust was not easy for him. But in that moment, he felt something he had not felt in decades: connection. Not just command, not just duty, but the fragile, dangerous beginnings of trust and understanding. Yet even as relief settled over them, danger lingered. The curse was tied to Kellen's bloodline, ancient and patient. It would not vanish entirely, and other enemies would use its power against them. Leora had proven herself invaluable. But the journey ahead promised more trials, more darkness, and the need for courage beyond anything either had faced before. That night, Kalen returned to his chambers, restless. He gazed out over the frost-covered city, remembering Leora's bravery, her defiance, and the spark of life she had ignited in him. For decades, he had ruled with fear and distance. Yet this Omega had touched something deep within him, something he had thought lost forever. And Leora, in her own chamber, lay awake as well. She could feel the bond forming between them, subtle, yet undeniable. The danger was not over. The storm still waited beyond the palace walls. But she no longer feared standing beside the Alpha King together. They were stronger than any curse, any shadow, any threat. The kingdom of Arender slept beneath a blanket of snow, unaware that the tides of power had begun to shift. One voice, brave and unbroken, had stirred the Alpha King from his frozen throne, and one soul, rejected yet unbowed, had begun to teach him the meaning of trust, courage, and connection. The winter wind had grown wild, carrying the scent of snow and the bitter edge of the mountains beyond Arender. The palace stood silent, save for the distant howl of unseen creatures and the occasional crash of ice falling from the towers. Kalen, the Alpha King, and Leora, the brave Omega, prepared to face the final trial that would determine not only their lives, but the fate of the kingdom itself, the curse that had haunted. Kellen's bloodline for centuries had grown stronger. It no longer lingered as shadows at the edges of the palace or whispers on the wind. Now it had taken form, a massive figure of frost and darkness, eyes glowing like cold stars. It moved with the weight of centuries, carrying the bitterness of countless ancestors who had failed to control it. Kalen stood at the forefront of the courtyard, his silver armor gleaming faintly in the pale light of dawn. Leora was beside him, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, not as a subject to a king, but as a partner in the struggle to come. Together, they were a balance of strength and courage, fire and ice. "You are ready?" Kalen asked, his voice calm despite the storm that raged both outside and within. "I am," Leora said firmly. "We face this together. I trust you." Kellen's eyes softened for a moment, a rare vulnerability breaking through the cold exterior. "And I trust you." Frost creature advanced, its form shifting, twisting between wolf-like limbs and humanoid shadows. The ground cracked beneath its feet, and the very air seemed to freeze with its presence. Yet Kalen and Leora did not hesitate. They stepped forward together, drawing strength not from weapons alone, but from the bond they had formed. The courage they had discovered in each other. Kalen struck first, moving with precision and force honed by years of battle. His sword met the creature's icy claws, shattering shards of frozen darkness. Leora followed, her courage guiding her actions. She did not fight with steel alone, but with the power she had drawn from her own inner strength. The magic of defiance and honesty that had brought her here. Her presence radiated warmth and light. Striking the shadows like the first rays of dawn, the creature recoiled, hissing and thrashing, its form unstable under the combined force of Alpha and Omega. Kellen's heart pounded not only with fear but with awe. Never had he felt such power beside him, power that came not from control or fear but from conviction and truth. Leora was not just brave, she was extraordinary. As the battle raged, the curse began to reveal its true form, a massive, shadowed version of Kalen himself. Twisted by centuries of fear, pride, and isolation, the creature's voice, a cold echo of his own, taunted him. "You cannot defeat me. You are bound by fear, bound by duty, bound by the choices you have made." Kellen's grip tightened on his sword. He looked at Leora, whose eyes shone with unwavering trust. Her courage reminded him of what he had long forgotten, that true strength came not from domination, but from connection. "You are wrong," Kalen said, voice firm. "I am not alone anymore." With a silent nod, Leora stepped forward, closing her eyes and extending her hand toward the shadowed form. Her presence radiated light, warmth, and the honesty of a soul that had endured rejection, yet refused to bow. The curse shivered, recoiling from her courage. The shadows flickered and twisted, unsure how to respond to this force that was not fear, not anger, not hatred, but truth. Kalen moved beside her, striking with renewed strength, not with the intent to destroy alone, but to combine their forces. Together, they became a single wave of power, courage, and determination. The shadowed Kalen faltered, confused by the unity it had never known. The bond of two souls standing as one, Leora's voice rang out, calm yet commanding. "This ends now. Your power over us ends here. We will not be ruled by fear or cursed by the past. We choose courage. We choose life. We choose each other." The creature screamed, a sound like cracking ice and distant thunder. The frozen air shattered, pieces of the curse exploding into shards that scattered into the wind. The shadows writhed, then dissipated, leaving only the empty frost behind. When the storm finally cleared, silence returned to the palace courtyard. Snow fell softly, almost gently, as if the land itself were sighing in relief. Kalen and Leora stood together, breathing heavily, hearts still racing from the intensity of the battle. For the first time in centuries, the curse was broken, or at least weakened enough to no longer control their fate. Kalen lowered his sword and turned to Leora, his eyes softer than she had ever seen. You were extraordinary," he said, his voice almost trembling with emotion. "I did not believe anyone could stand beside me, let alone beside the darkness that has haunted my family for centuries. You have changed me, Omega, more than anyone ever has." Leora smiled faintly, brushing snow from her cloak. "You changed to Alpha King. You opened yourself to trust, to courage, to something beyond fear. That is how we won together." For the first time, Kalen allowed himself to step fully away from the armor of coldness and fear he had worn for decades. The kingdom was still fragile, the winter still harsh, but the bond between them had created a new strength. Not the strength of domination or fear, but the strength of trust, courage, unity. Over the next days, Kalen moved through the palace and the kingdom with Leora at his side. His rule began to change not overnight, but slowly, imperceptibly at first. The people of Arendar noticed it in small ways. Less fear, more listening, more understanding. Kellen's words carried weight, but now they carried hope as well. And the Omega who had dared to speak truth to a king became a symbol of courage for all. Yet even in moments of calm, both knew that the world beyond the palace walls remained uncertain. Magic lingered in the land, and shadows could rise again. But they also knew that together, they could face whatever came. Trust had been forged in fire and ice. Courage had been proven against impossible odds. And a bond deeper than fear or duty had taken root. One evening, Kalen and Leora stood on the balcony overlooking the snow-covered city. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The air was crisp but lighter, freer, as if the land itself had been unburdened. "You were right," Kalen said quietly, voice carrying across the terrace. "I have ruled too long with fear. I have forgotten that strength comes not from control, but from trust." "You have taught me that, Leora." Leora looked at him, green eyes reflecting the sunset. "And you have taught me that courage is stronger when shared. That even the coldest heart can warm if given a chance. That even the strongest king can be human." Kalen reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was gentle, respectful, full of something more than duty or command. It was trust and recognition. And the beginning of something neither had dared to name fully. The city below them sparkled in the fading light. A kingdom no longer ruled solely by fear, but by hope and courage. The wind whispered softly, carrying memories of the past, the trials they had faced, and the promise of what was to come. And though the future remained uncertain, Kalen and Leora knew one thing for certain: they would face it together. No curse, no shadow, no enemy, could break the bond forged in fire and ice. Together, they had transformed the kingdom, themselves, and each other. As night fell over Arendar, the palace stood tall and silent. The storm had passed, leaving only the soft blanket of snow. But far in the distance, the faint shimmer of magical energy hinted that the world was not without its mysteries. The trials might return, and shadows might rise again, but for now, the Alpha King and the Omega had triumphed. Their hands met, fingers entwining in a quiet promise, not of crowns or power, but of trust, courage, and shared destiny. They were equals now, not ruler and subject, but two souls who had faced darkness and emerged stronger.